Okay, so this workshop is Teach Like a Pirate My Way. It is strategies that I use in my classroom to help my students and engage them in learning. I'll be using this workshop at the New Teacher in Service, and I'm going to share it with you today. So the vision at our school is to inspire every student at Blessing Elementary to grow as a whole person and develop a passion for lifelong learning in our community and beyond. So some strategies that I'm going to be sharing with you today are going to really engage your student into helping them grow a passion for learning, and also about building relationships to help them grow as a whole person while they're learning. Okay, so first step to greatness. What I do is take a little from a whole lot of sources. So some of my favorite sources thus far are Whole Brain Teaching. And what I get from Whole Brain Teaching is to focus on rules and expectations and teach those rules and expectations the first week of school. And then I reward them when they're showing me those types of behaviors that I'm wanting. So whenever they do something that they're not supposed to in class, then I have them go practice their rules. Alright, so the next is Reading in the Wild. And in Reading in the Wild, I learned strategies and good reasons for having my students read more in the classroom, having them read self-selected text that is a good fit for them. And so by doing that, it really helped grow the reader self-efficacy and a confidence in what I wanted them to learn. Next is Teach Like a Pirate. A lot of my collaborative activities and passion came from this book, and as well as Learn Like a Pirate. My Monday morning meetings, it was a really great read that I suggest anyone read. It was about growing leadership and having students really grow that leadership in the classroom as well, letting others know that they have a voice whenever they're in groups. I use Tap and Think, Reading, and the Writing Academy. The reason why I like Tap and Think reading is because the students get to draw as well as while they're reading. So they're drawing and reading at the same time, and anytime you are putting two parts of your brain to work like that, it helps that you remember more. The Writing Academy as well, there's lots of acronyms and strategies that involve multi-parts of the brain to help the students remember it. The next thing is Do You Know Enough About Me to Teach Me? And that really helped with building relationships and learning that our students come with their own baggage and problems, and the more that you learn and get to know and develop those relationships with your students, the better you can teach them. Fundamental 5 I like because I like to do their small group purposeful talk, and getting the students to talk and make connections with each other within the content before we move on really helps, one, them to communicate, and two, to make those connections. And then Talk, Read, Talk, Write is just like it sounds. We'll talk about it, we'll read it, and then we'll talk, have a small group talk again, and then we'll write about it. So talking, reading, and writing, putting all three of those together helps them just to remember it more in the content areas. Alright, the next slide is Create to Remember and Evaluate Others. So in my classroom, I focus on the top 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. I do not plan anything for the bottom 3. Now they're going to just come in throughout daily, but I really make sure that I focus on my top 3 levels of Bloom's. Creating is one that we do with our vocabulary posters, which you'll see in a little bit. Evaluate, which is the second level, we do debating, and I also use responsibility partners when I'm evaluating and analyzing. So when they have responsibility partners, I give them a partner. They're both working on an assignment, but they're both responsible for making sure that each other has the required amount of things done before it can be turned in. So if they come to me to turn in their paper, but yet their responsibility partner is way behind them, then they haven't done a good job of making sure that they're keeping up with the responsibility partner. So it's just to make sure you're not only responsible for your work, but you're also responsible for keeping your responsibility partner on task. You're responsible for making sure your responsibility partner has all the different requirements done before they can turn theirs in. If your responsibility partner has any questions, you're to answer them first before they come to me. So just getting them to work together and talk and communicate and discuss, because when we talk and communicate and discuss, it helps us remember it more.
Would you mind turning that light off? It makes it a little hard to see. There, thank you.
All right, and so this is kind of hard to see, but it says reading is the key to all subjects, and I have a quote here: "Knowledge is the key that unlocks all the doors," by Ben Carson. So basically what this slide is showing you is that all content areas need and involve reading. So when we're reading, we are reading and comprehending things that we need for real life experiences. And you have some students that are like, "Miss, why do we have to learn this?" Well, we need to show them and teach them that we're learning this because this is what you need it for in the real world. And so by having them read, it develops their vocabulary. So when they grow up and they're trying to get a job, they have good vocabulary, and they'll be a better candidate than someone who hasn't. And mathematics, you have to be able to compute. But if you don't know how to read, how can you compute word problems? So reading is connected to math and everyday life. Reading is connected to science and social studies. And a lot of times the nonfiction text is what students are struggling on. So if you take that 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of every class period to have them read a self-selected text, then they're going to be developing vocabulary words that are going to help them in not only reading, but math and science and social studies. So reading is the base and the key to all subjects, not just reading class, but reading needs to be done everywhere. I don't know what is wrong with this. So reading time. Every class and every subject should take 5 to 10 minutes to read at the beginning of every class period. Why? Because it benefits everyone. It benefits the reading teacher, it benefits the math teacher, it benefits the science and social studies teacher. There's no space there.
I know, I wasn't saying
Better math comprehension, better science comprehension, better social studies comprehension. So what I do is, as we read, we define vocabulary words within the reading. So as I'm reading the story, in the flow of the book, I will say the word, and then I will say a quick definition afterwards and continue reading. So kind of like if you had it in little parentheses. So I just insert that knowledge as I'm reading, and then I have some kids who pick up on it, some kids who don't. But I make a list of all of the words, and then I add them to my bulletin board, or I tape them on the wall. And at the end of each chapter, you could take 2 days. So if it took you 5 minutes during this class period, and 5 minutes and 5 minutes, that gives you 2 more days worth of 5 minutes. Well, then you could have them create a poster on Pick, Collage, or Prezi over one of their vocabulary words that you assign to them. So what I do is I assign each child their own vocabulary word. And I might have a couple of students who have the same, but they're working independently during this point. They will have a responsibility partner to make sure that they're getting their parts finished, but they're each going to have a different word. So on the third day, after they've made the poster, I have them make an inside-outside circle and teach their classmates. So basically I have one group of students who are sitting in a circle facing out, and then I had the other group of students who were in a circle facing in, and then we rotate around like a clock this way. So everyone has, I set the timer for 1 minute, and each group has to present their word to the other. So if there are multiple words, then you're getting taught that word more than one time. So everyone has to teach their word. So what I say is you've got 30 seconds to teach your word to your partner has 30 seconds. So that means that you, when this is over, have taught your word 12 times. And so that word is something that you're going to be more likely to remember, as well as you probably picked up on a few of the other words that you've read as it was going around. So I just put at the bottom, hint, a math book is, you can pull math vocabulary out of it. If you had a science book, pull your science vocabulary out. It doesn't have to be just reading vocabulary. It could be content-specific vocabulary within the text that you're reading that'll help them build that vocabulary that they're going to need for the STAR test. So here's an example of a story that I use. I chose Bunnicula, and I've done Bunnicula for the past 2 years. So with the story Bunnicula, I would read a chapter a day, and not a chapter a day, a chapter a week. And what I did is I created, I went through the book and I picked out words that I felt were most needed in their vocabulary. And so I just listed those words. In my book, I underline the words and I write the definition out to the side. That way, as I'm reading, I can say, admonition, a warning, and then continue reading. So that's an example of the words I use. So for my vocabulary word poster, this is what my students would see posted on my board. They also have a copy of it with them as well. But I would say, using this rubric below, create a poster explaining your vocabulary word. You will teach this word to your classmates. Have your responsibility partner check your work before you print. And so they have a specific guidelines that they have to use in order to make their poster. So one thing that I didn't always do this way, but I have found to be the most profound in teaching vocabulary, is they are responsible for looking their word up by themselves in a dictionary, and I never tell them which definition it is. They have to go back, they have to look at the sentence in which they found it, the sentence before, the sentence it's in, and the sentence after, and they have to use the strategies that I taught them to be able to figure out which is the correct definition. And so if they're not sure, they have a responsibility partner. Them and their responsibility partner can discuss and evaluate to see which one they think is the correct definition. And then once they have found that one, they're going to go ahead and start making their vocabulary poster. As I'm walking around and monitoring, and if I see a definition that is being used on their poster that's not correct, I'm going to say, hey, I noticed that you put this definition, can you tell me why? And they're going to have to explain to me why they put that definition there. If it's the wrong definition, I'm going to go back and point the sentence that they're in, and I'm going to say, hey, this is what the sentence says. These are the words that I see that are clues. Now, can you tell me how the definition you picked explains this? And most likely they see the mistake that they've made, and they're going to go back and look for another definition. Now, I don't tell them again. They go back, they look, and they find another definition, and then they'll have to repeat the process. Tell me about this definition. Why did you choose this? So the whole time they're doing these vocabulary posters, I'm walking around and communicating and making them explain why they chose what they chose, why the images they picked or what they picked, what the synonyms and the antonyms were, how did they find them. By the end of the year, they were really good at going to certain sites and figuring out which ones were good to use and which ones were not. This is what I used to grade them after they were finished. It's the same exact thing, just on a smaller scale. I just cut them in half and graded their posters like that. So here's an example that I showed them, because this was their very first book that they read, and their very first poster to create. So I wanted to be able to give them a few examples of what it would look like to be able to make 100. So I just put the word, and I found an image with some antonyms and synonyms. I had the definition, the picture, and I used the word in a sentence. So I did this with each one of their first chapter vocabulary words, and I would go over and each of them and discuss what we did. That way they would know what was expected of them. But I only did it with the first chapter because after that they've had a view of what it's supposed to look like, and I wanted them to use their creativity and expression after that. So the word cards that I put on my bulletin boards look like this. They're just a word with a picture. And I did that because I did not want to put the definition up there. I want them to learn the definition, have a picture to associate it in their brain, and the word. So they got really good at looking at the pictures, and it gave them clues as to what the words were. And then we would play certain games with them. So I'm going to skip through to one of the games that I would play. I started playing with them, and it was Guess the Word. And so all the words are up on the bulletin board, and again, just words and pictures, no definitions. And I would say, I am spoken words. I can be spoken differently in different places. Hola, hi, ciao, what am I? And they would have to raise their hand and guess what the word was. Well, the student who guessed the correct word then got to give clues for the next word. So the first time we did this, they had a sheet to follow because I wanted them to see how it was correctly done. But then after that first chapter, they created their own during transitions, and I'll show you that in a minute. But I had mentioned earlier about using the top 3 levels of Bloom. So for my first questioning, I started out with just 3 bottom level questions. So they wouldn't have to think a whole lot, just real easy, just to get them warmed up and started. And then I moved up to the 4th level of Blooms. You know, what can you infer? And I put guess because we're just learning this language, and just like I would in my stories, I like to just plant that definition in there for them. And then, you know, I moved on to more higher levels. If you were going to rate the brothers, Pete and Toby's relationship, how would you rate them? That's, you know, evaluating or analyzing, you know, someone else. And then solve the puzzle to decipher the note attached to Benicula's neck, and then create a new name using the code above. So that just enabled them to use those higher levels of Bloom to conceptualize their knowledge. Create a sentence using the word admonition. Design your own reverie. Chester looked at Miss Monroe plaintively, explain what kind of look that would be. Make up a sentence using the word digress correctly, because we've been using these words every day. I wanted to make sure that they could do that. And then I did the same thing for every chapter with different activities. The next book that I went through was Hank the Cowdog. I did the same thing with Hank the Cowdog. And then I introduced a new game. Let's look at Hank. So same thing. This time I didn't have to create the posters. I just, you know, had my words, and I created my word wall cards just like I did in Benicula. And so my Benicula word wall stayed up until Benicula was over, and then we started a new one. And I didn't add the words until I had read the chapter. Once I read the chapter, then I put up the words. But one game that we played in Hank, again, we played Guess the Word. But I think, let's see. We did a game called Name That Word. The purpose of this game was that they had to create their own sign, using a vocabulary word without revealing what the word was. So they were in a group of 4 students in a collaborative group. Each group member chose a different word from the list, and they created a sign illustrating that vocabulary word of their choice. It could not be the same as any other member in that group. The illustration must have at least 3 synonyms and or phrases as clues for the word, but could not use that word at all. Once the groups were finished, they presented their posters in front of the whole class. So the group was awarded 1 point if no one could name their word in 3 tries. If the word is named in 3 tries, the group who names it gets the point. So if there are 4 students in a group, all 4 present, they could earn up to 4 points if no one guesses their words. So, it just encouraged them to create and then to be able to think and decide what their words were. And you would constantly see them going back and looking at the word wall to be able to pick and see what their words were. Another game that we played, which is one of my favorites, was I had them do it with Hank the Cowdog, but when I have a bigger group presentation at the New Teacher in Service, I created a dictionary called 10 Words You Probably Don't Know Dictionary. But for Hank the Cowdog, what I did was I just took the words that were in that chapter, and I had the group start with one person. That person had a dictionary, and I created the dictionary. The dictionary was just for that Hank the Cowdog chapter. So, I think it was chapter 4. Is it real? Okay, so that dictionary, their dictionary looked like this. Chapter 5, Hank the Cowdog. And then inside of it, they had their words and their definitions. So what they did was one person, everybody had index cards, and they would say the word out loud, absurd. And everybody would write down a dictionary looking definition of what they thought absurd meant, while the person who had the dictionary wrote down the real definition. So nobody knew whose cards were whose. They were all shuffled up and put in the end. And then the person who had the cards read all the definitions out, and the group voted on what they thought the correct dictionary definition of the word was. Sometimes they picked the word that was correct, and other times they picked ones that just sounded like it could be the right definition. So then the person would say, you got a point because you picked the right one, but here's the right definition, and they would explain it, and then we'd move on to the next one who picked a different word. So it was just, is it the real definition or is it not? They really enjoyed that. So I did create one for teachers, and it was 10 words you probably didn't know, just silly words like darkle, peely-wally, things that we probably wouldn't know that would be good for teachers to play the game. And so whenever I do New Teacher in Service, I will have them play that game. So another really cool vocabulary activity I did was graffiti vocabulary. And the reason why I'm sharing all these vocabulary experiences is because it could be used in any content area. Whether it's math or science or social studies, you could take this and really get them to build relationships with your vocabulary words and learn them and keep them. So this graffiti vocabulary word, I had a different vocabulary word written on each whiteboard. And I did this before I read the chapter. And I gave everyone a marker, and I had them wander around the room predicting what they thought the word means, and then they would just write it in. And so after they were all finished writing what they thought, I would have someone come up and present, and then we would have a debate on what we thought was the correct definition. And then after we were finished with that, I'd read the chapter. And so they had, just more preconceived knowledge of what the words meant in a fun and interesting way. And you could see if your kids already knew all these words, then you didn't have to spend much time on them. You could, move on to other important things. So why would I want to waste time reading when I could be preparing for the state test? Well, I get that a lot, and reading is a part of everything, and if your math students can't read, it's going to affect your math test, and if your science students can't read, it's going to affect your science test. So students make connections to the subject area that you are teaching and the real world. So when you're reading and you stop and you have that small time purposeful talk, have your students make connections. Have you ever, let's say if you're reading a book about snow, and we live in Texas, maybe some of them aren't old enough and haven't seen snow, and maybe some of them have been and visited areas. So where is a time that you've seen snow? Maybe it was on television. They're all going to have some type of connection, but it's important for them to be able to share those connections with other students and really take that learning and make it personal. This 5 to 10 minutes of reading could be the difference in a few passing because of increased comprehension. It's a proven fact. The more you read, the more you retain, the better you do on your tests. Reading strengthens brain connections and builds new connections. So as you're reading and you're making those connections, your brain is also making connections and then building new ones to new things you've learned from other readers' experiences, other stories, things that you didn't know because you've never been and now you've read about them. Reading improves concentration, building that stamina. I spend the first month of school building stamina with my students. We go from like 1 minute and 15 seconds to 30 minutes of stamina, and it usually takes about a month because they're not used to reading that long. They don't have the focus. Yet they can focus on a TV because it's constantly changing all the time, but your STAR test in front of you is not going to constantly change all the time. So you have to be able to build that stamina to make and improve that concentration to be able to sit through these state tests. And practice makes perfect. Anytime you do something, you're better at it the next time. So the more you read, the better you're going to get. And readers achieve more in school in all areas. So if you're a reader, you're going to be a better math person, you're going to be a better science person, you're going to be better at social studies, because reading is involved in all content areas. And then back again to the stamina. Reading builds stamina, and stamina is needed to attack that STAR test. If they can't sit through 3 hours of reading, they're not going to be successful when it comes to taking that test. So what I did here is there are some titles to inspire all subjects, and I just went through and I made some suggestions of math books and science books. And now these are chapter books, most of them, because I like to read a chapter a week and really dig into that vocabulary. But there's books that pertain to math, there's books that pertain to science. I also have some books that pertain to, I forgot to add that, social studies is this column here, and then reading. And Bunnicula, Hank the Cowdog, The Boxcar Children were books that we read this year. And I will tell you that it is okay if you start reading a chapter book with your students and they're not interested in it to abandon that book. I had to do that this year with The Boxcar Children. I thought I was starting out with the very first Boxcar book, but it was actually the pre-first book, and it was really slow, and the students were having a hard time getting into it. So we abandoned that book and moved on to something else, but it's okay to do that. If you see that your students are not interested, stop the book, get a different one, and move on. I will tell you that I've had Hank the Cowdog books on my library shelf for 2 years now, and they had never been touched. And so this year I decided to read them, Hank the Cowdog, and once I did, I could not keep those books on the shelf. So I think a lot of times that they might be scared or intimidated or think that the books look old, and so they don't look enticing to them, but once they hear you read it, they just really gravitate towards it, and then you can't keep them on your shelf. So my vocabulary wall that I put up, just to reiterate, it's just words and an image, nothing else. No definitions. I add it as I go with each chapter. I do not use any more than 10 to 12 words per chapter. I really just focus on the words that I think will help them more. And but you don't have to do it over a chapter. It could be over a unit in your book if you're using a basal. And then I review those words daily. It's a daily part of our vocabulary. So these are some ways that I review the vocabulary. One way is don't break the ice. I have students get into 2 lines, and we're facing the board with all the words on it, and then I'll do a guess the word type, and whoever raises their hand first gets to say. So if they said the correct word, they get to knock out a cube of ice. And the team that knocks all the ice down loses, and the other team wins. And they really, really enjoy that. I do the same thing with Jenga. If they get the word correct, they get to poke out a Jenga. Whoever knocks a tower over, that group loses. Connect 4, they really enjoy. I've done it here with I've actually done them 2 at the same time. That way I could have more kids interacting. I had 2 groups here and 2 groups here. It just kept them moving through the line faster. It kept their attention span. And I've also played it on the board where they took a sticky note. And so if they got the correct answer, they put up their color sticky note wherever they wanted it. And so then the team that got 4 sticky notes in a row won. I've also done Quizlet Live, which is really cool and awesome. I have a link to take a group of the new in-service teachers to take them to that and actually have them play Quizlet Live. But Quizlet Live works if you have, at least 3 or 4 people. But if you haven't heard of it, it's a really fun way to interact. The next way that I bring in my vocabulary is during transition time. My own students created this, not me. They asked, hey, as we're lining up, can we play What's the Word? And I said, absolutely. And so they line up. The first student in line, which is always like, hey, can I get there first? Calls out a word, a definition, and from the vocabulary wall, the students raise their hands. If they say the correct one, they change spots, and they just do this all by themselves and keep going until it's time for us to switch. So it really encourages them to line up quickly, and because they want to play the game. Another thing I do for transition time that I adapted from Whole Brain Teaching, which they have a class, and the students say yes, yes, to get their attention. But I needed to teach adages, and I was having a really hard time fitting that in with everything else that I had to teach, but adages was a part of the STAR test. So what I did was I started teaching them 1 adage a week. And so let's say I was teaching them practice makes perfect. I would explain it all on Monday. We would discuss what it means. Have you ever had someone else tell you that? We would do our small group purposeful talk. And then I got to thinking, you know what? Why don't I just say practice makes and you say perfect? And so I just kind of stumbled upon that myself. And so I would do that one for the week. And then once we had 2, I would switch off the 2. That way they didn't forget the first one we learned. And then you never knew which one I was going to say, and you know what? They always responded correctly. So they learned a whole lot of adages just through me needing to get their attention. So it's just finding little ways like that where you're not wasting time, but instead of using something else, you're giving them more knowledge in that way. So I have to reward their knowledge. They work so hard to show me everything they learn, and I need to reward them. So I use the whole brain teaching method of moving from a fan to a living legend. They have these little, it's kind of hard to see, but they have these little papers, and it has 10 boxes in them. And so when I first started using whole brain teaching, I would just give them a star for behavior purposes. And then I got to thinking, why am I just giving them a star for behavior purposes when they're doing so many other amazing things in the classroom? So then it just happened one day that one of my students said, hey, I was reading last night and I found a vocabulary word in our book. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. You found a vocabulary word and you were reading last night like I told you to? Great job. I'm going to give you a star for that. Well, then everybody else that read at night was trying so hard to find their vocabulary words because they wanted to come to school and get a star the next day. And it's just a pen mark star. So then I had some students this year that really used my vocabulary words in their everyday conversation. So every time I heard them use one, I would give them a star. Well, then I'd have another one over here who would make up a sentence using one to try to get a star too. But I just rewarded that first person who just used it just spontaneously. Exactly. And I used to get my feelings hurt anytime my students corrected me because, like, you're calling me out on a mistake. But then I got to thinking I'm going to reward them for finding my mistakes because they were listening to me. And so if they're listening to me well enough to figure out that I made a mistake, then they need to be rewarded for it. So there were times that I would say the wrong definition with the word on purpose just to see if anybody was paying attention to me, and then reward those students for that. And then sometimes I just messed up and they figured it out and they got a star for it. They were always so happy. Yes. And so then I had some students who would go and read their books and be like, Ms. Hackfeld, I don't think that you should have used a comma there. Do you think that book needs a comma there? Because they're trying to get a star. I'm like, yes, I promise. Editors looked through that book, but there were a couple of passages that we did read that they did find typos on, and I had to give them a star for it. Yes. So another thing I did was I asked the parents to take pictures of their children when they were caught reading, and then I posted those pictures in the hallway. And so everybody who went could see the students reading. I had one reading in the car, one right before the bed. I just had hundreds of pictures of kids reading, and we were able to put them out in the hallway. And believe me, they would say, my mama sent you a picture last night, and it's not up on that board yet. So they wanted to be up there, and they wanted me to see that they were reading. And so I'd put picture of me reading as well, to know that I do not just teach all day, I read some as well. So another way that I was able to reach my students is making use of any extra time I had. I would have, it just happened by chance. I had a parent say, you taught my child last year and he's still struggling now in 4th grade, and is there any way you can do fluency with him? And I said, sure, have him come in at 7:15 in the morning. Well, when he started coming in at 7:15 in the morning, there was a slow trickle of other students, and I thought, you know what, if I'm going to do fluency with him in the mornings, why don't I do fluency with my other students that I need to do fluency with in the mornings? So then it evolved into 35 kids that came to my classroom at 7:15 every morning, and a lot of them I had to say, have you had breakfast yet? Because you need to go eat first. Because then they would stay in my class and not eat. So what I did was I completed fluency checks, and I just included one of my students in their fluency progress over the time that they were with me. So I was completing those fluency checks, and the other students, I had to figure out what do I do with them, because I don't want them to just come in my room and be loud and distract my others, but I don't want to turn them away either. They're wanting to come into my room. So I gave them options. They could either play on iExcel, Education Galaxy, iStation. They could read. They could take AR test, and they can read on Epic. They really came in, worked hard, enjoyed, liked having the choice of what they could do. And so one of them said, well, hey, how about on Fridays we get to play any game? Because I'm like, you know what, that's not a bad idea. I'll reward you. If you do these for me all week, on Friday, I'll give you a free choice. And so on Friday, I gave them a free choice, and a lot of times they would choose math. It was some math program that they wanted to get on, and because I would always say when they came in from 7:15, 7:45, oh no, you're doing reading. You find some kind of reading on iStation or reading on Education Galaxy.
Right.
You know, not the social studies, not even though there's reading in there too.
Mm-hmm.
But on Fridays, I let them go into the other content areas and explore that. And a lot of them on Fridays chose to just read. But I also let them do board games. And these were just learning board games that I had sitting in my closet. And when they started to get interested in the board games, I thought, I'll pull them out and see. So I started using them in my tutorial groups to teach them how to play. And then my tutorial students were teaching all my other students how to play the games. So they felt, you know, just like they knew everything and were getting to teach these other kids something. And they really, really enjoyed that. So it was a win-win for me. I got an extra 2 hours of learning in, and they got 30 minutes of free time. So
That's great.
the next thing I learned was location is very important and key to learning, as well as having your students involved in the creating process. So I probably make 50 anchor charts every year, and I never keep them, and it almost kills me every time I fold them up and put them in the recycling, because I think of how many connections we made and how much time and effort we put into reviewing these every day. But every year I put them in the recycling because I know the next group of students need to make those connections as well. So they remember better when they're a part of creating the learning, and students learn best when concepts are taught and reviewed in certain locations around the room. So whenever I was teaching making inferences, I had a little song that went with it, and then every time we referred back, I referred to the poster in the same spot. It never moved. So even during STAR review, I was thinking I should probably take all my posters. I knew I had to take my posters down or cover them up. So I decided to just put another clean sheet of paper over it. That way they still knew it was there. And I would see them looking up at that blank paper, but you could see their wheels turning like, hey, I remember what was there. So location of where you put something, you know, put it there and keep it there and review it from that same spot, and then they will look up and remember it later on. And we would just always review it from that same location, and it always stayed there, and then they would know where to refer back to it. Anytime we were doing any type of worksheet, or like we're doing collaborative grouping and they had their passage and it would come to a question about imagery, you would see them looking over in that exact spot, looking for that poster to be able to remember that knowledge. So that brings me into the acronyms with movement. I found that my students did better whenever I would teach it from the same spot, whenever I had movement, and whenever I had either a word or a song to go with it. So for reading, I have fiction and nonfiction. I would just say, let me entertain you, reading just for fun, or to find out what's going to happen next. And so that would help them, you know, remember the difference between fiction and nonfiction. And if they would ask me, is this fiction or nonfiction? I would just start singing the song. They would finish it, and then they would have their answer. I didn't answer them, I just sang the song. You saw my inferencing poster on the one before, and I would just say, I take what I've read, and I take what I already know, I put it together, boom, inference, I can infer. And so I also did that because I used to just say boom, inference, but then I added I can infer because they were using infer in the questioning of the STAR passage. So I wanted them to know inference and infer go together. Summary, I did whole story and a little tiny bit, but don't forget something from the beginning, something from the middle, something from the end. And then as I was going through Tap and Think reading, we had cars for summary, and then I would say, and while driving your cars, because I wanted them to remember cars. And so when I taught them, I always did cars, characters, actions, reactions, and setting. And so I always moved. If I was talking about characters, I was always here. If I was talking about actions, I was always here. If I was talking about reactions, I would stand in this spot. Now if I was talking about setting, I'd stand over here. So every time I was talking, I was always moving back and forth to these different spots, but then they remembered, and they would correct me sometimes if because another one was tracks that I used, and they would say, you forgot the K. Then I'd have to go back over and start again. So just lots of different ways to help them remember it. I also use secret stories to remind them when they were writing, you know, A-W-A-U, love each other, aw. And so just me going, it says aw, what do you think it is? And those posters were in the same spot. They always knew exactly where to look. So I added some other ones for math. Now, I've never taught math, social studies, or science, but I asked some others for their opinion and kind of looked on Pinterest. So there are some for math and social studies and science for those of you who teach that content. It's just really important to get them using, you know, more than one type of learning style to remember something. So, communication. What I see is a lack of communication, more so in today's children because of cell phones, iPads. If you go in the grocery store, most of the time the kids have a phone and they're not paying any attention to what their parents are getting. It's easier for the parents because they're not asking for anything. So now we have to do a lot of teaching that communication in our classroom. So I teach empathy. You know, what is empathy? What does it feel like? What does it look like? We act it out. I reward them stars for showing it. Compassion, you know, a lot of how would you feel if that happened to you? Talk to your partner about a time when something like that happened. A lot of small group purposeful talk about their feelings, their connections. When we have a story and we're talking about theme, and you know the theme is empathy, and so what happened? You know, how did that make you feel? Talk to your partner about it. And when I ask them, I will say, how did your partner feel about that? I don't ask them how would you feel, because I want to know were they being good listeners.
Right.
So not only is communicating about talking, it's also about listening. Make them talk. I'm going to show you a video here in a second, hoping it works, where you have those students that sit in the background and let other people do the talking for them, and you have to specifically call them out and make them talk to be a part of it. And building relationships, getting to know what your students like, what do they not like, are they playing baseball, have you been to a game, do you see them at the grocery store and talk to them? Just, you know, do you communicate to their parents their positives, you know, not just their negatives? Just building those relationships with the parents and with the students. So hopefully this will work and you can hear. And I don't know if it is. It's going slow, but maybe I should have pressed play before. Oh, here it goes. Before I started talking. What I did, and I'll kind of explain it when I'm talking through here, but this is during a enrichment group of tutorials from 8:15 to 8:45, and they had to work in a collaborative group to build an island, and then some thieves came to their island and were going to steal all their supplies, and they had 5 minutes to create a trap. So they had to work together first to build their island, and then they had to change their expectations of their island to be able to fix it for the thief that was coming in. So you had time to build an island, and then you found out that a thief was on the island, and you had 10 minutes to build a truck to catch him before he took all of your stuff. So what did y'all do?
We built this staircase because there's gold in there, and once he jumps in, he's automatically locked because we got a gel door right here, and the window's gonna close.
Oh, okay. So he got the door. So he's gonna walk up the stairs to look for the gold, and when he does, he falls in.
And also there's not stairs going back up.
Oh.
And this is automatic.
And what did you have on your island, Stephanie, that you wanted to protect? Just standing in the back, not participating. Gold. And what would you use that gold for on your island?
To get a boat.
To get a boat. All right. You had a boat on your island? I think y'all did great. So basically, you know, just getting them to talk and tell you why they did things the way they did it, and making those students who normally sit in the background come up and express what they put together in part of that group. So in my collaborative grouping, I didn't always teach this way, but I have come through a lot of reading in my own professional development, and Teach Like a Pirate had a lot of, examples in there. So did Learn Like a Pirate, but two brains are always better than one. So I group students randomly majority of the time. Sometimes I ability group. You have to teach the group norms. I had signs, speaker, recorder, task manager, timekeeper, and then sometimes I would use, you can see here I have playing cards. So if you had a diamond, then all the diamonds in the group would be the task managers. If you had a heart, all the hearts would be the speakers. And you can see I have a group, collaborative group here working, and you can see all their cards at the table with them, so they know what their responsibility is. Then when I had them move to a different table, I would take and move so that the next person could be the recorder, and the next person could be the task manager. That way everybody has the opportunity for certain jobs. Another time I used collaborative grouping, we were working on a passage, and I had the questions typed up, laminated, and they had to choose an answer, and then they had to prove why they chose that answer. And it couldn't be because I found it in the passage, and so this one here said, the text said she was grossed out, and she was grossed out because they had to stay there for 2 weeks. And so, her evidence led them to the correct answer. Each group had little magnifying glasses. So I came and told them that I had been hired as the new chief investigator, and that they were all in training to be investigators. And so their job was to investigate and find the correct answers and why, because good investigators always know why. And so each group had a little magnifying glass, and you would see them looking through the passage, trying to find their evidence. So, I just presented it in a way that they would think it was fun to find the evidence, and not just a normal look in the passage, find your answers, but, give them something fun. Another time I took all the questions and I cut them apart and glued them on a sheet of butcher paper, and I had butcher paper all the way down the hallway for all 10 questions. And then I had I had sentence stems that they had to answer So it was, what answer do you think is, well, we started out with, what is the question asking you? What do you already know? This answer is correct because, and this answer is wrong because, this answer is wrong because, and this answer is wrong because. So they worked with their groups and they had to answer all of those questions, and when they were finished, I would have them rotate on down to the next group. And when they were finished, they had to present their posters. We did this during baseball, during our Star Baseball review, because at that point they're tired of looking at passages. So just really cutting it apart and letting them lay out on the floor was another way of getting them to do it in just a different atmosphere. So here was my Star Baseball review. You can see I have my my poster taped to the outside of the school windows. So what I would do is between each inning, we would come and present a poster. So we would play baseball, and then we would review a poster. And then we'd play baseball, and then we'd review our poster. And so it was just a great way of getting them to review and think about the answer choices, why they picked those answers. And what I did was I rewarded them with tickets. And so for all the answers they got correct, they got one color ticket. And then they got another color ticket for showing their proof. So at the end, they took when they showed proof, I put those names at the end of each week into a raffle, and I would draw, and 2 people would be chosen out of each class to pick a baseball item. And for the other tickets, they collected them for 4 weeks, and then they bought items for their baseball party. And we went into the gym and watched Everybody's Hero, and had popcorn and pickles and sunflower seeds and chili dogs, and just rewarding them for all their review and their hard work. Another thing I did was debate. I had my students work collaboratively when answering passages, because I wanted them to be able to discuss and decide why they chose the answer they chose. But ultimately, at the end, if you and your partner do not agree, you each pick your own answer choice. But discuss, analyze, and then pick your own if you don't agree. And it happened almost every time they answered a question with some students. But whenever they were completely finished, I took up all of their passages and their answers, and I had everybody put up their pencils, pens, erasers, anything. And then I repassed out their papers, so they have nothing. I put 2 desks up at the front of the classroom like debate stands. And as I know what the correct answer is, I'm walking around. I said, okay, you're going to go, because I know he got the wrong answer. And then I picked another student who had the right answer. They don't know which student's the right student, but they're both up there, and they have to defend their answer. And, you know, some of them will sit there and argue back and forth with each other, and then we'll have to take a vote on who agrees with who. And then sometimes the other person will state their case, and this one will go and he'll be like, oh, you're right, I didn't think about it that way, you win. And so they're able to really, you know, we learned what debate was. You know, it's to argue to get to a point where you can agree on something. And so, or still disagree, even keep your own answer. Right. But they got to take turns defending their answers and debating. And at the end, I would say, and high five the winner. And that's all they wanted. They just wanted a high five. And then I'd call the next 2 up and continue until all the questions were done. So I have a student who is who's always made, you know, pretty good grades, and she comes up to me after the debate when she turns her paper in, and she said, is there any way that we're going to get to correct this? Because as we were going through, I missed a little more than I'd like to. I'm like, no, you still get to keep your grade, but we now know what the correct answers are, right?
That's right.
So I did have a few of those. Oh, why is it not going? I've had more trouble. So passion, I didn't really realize what I was doing was passion until I had gone through and read Teach Like a Pirate. And so there's just a couple of examples of showing my passion in the classroom. This one was whenever we were doing text features and I had them do text feature surgery. And so I had done it the year before and the kids kind of enjoyed it, but I really wanted to just add a little bit more depth to it. So this time I had heartbeat music playing like they were in an operating room. I told them how quiet an operating room was, and they were so quiet. And each of them had a responsibility partner. You can see these two working. I had went on Amazon and bought them little caps and little, of course they didn't last very long on the gloves because they didn't like the way they felt, but their face masks on so they didn't get any germs. And they just went through, what they had to do was they had to, it was a scavenger hunt, so it would tell you what you're looking for. And then they had to go find it. They had to take a picture of it on their iPad and insert it into a template. And so when they turned it in, they had to turned in their scavenger paper, but they also had to print out their template showing me exactly where each of them were found. And so, you know, it was technology, which they enjoy, and it was finding. Another one was I had went to Cabo, and while I was there, I was just thinking about how I was going to be reviewing inferencing when I got back. So I created an inferencing activity for them. So I said that we had a guest speaker. I came out of the went out of the classroom really quickly, put on like a little swim top and a floppy hat and some sunglasses, and I had a suitcase, and there were some of them that did not know it was me until I took my sunglasses off at the end, you know, but a couple of them did know. But I just put where in the world was Miss Hackfold. They knew I went somewhere. Where was I? What did I see? And so I just used my experience to ask them inferencing questions and get them to infer where I was, what was I doing. On this one, I was so amazed. That one of them said that I was scuba diving because they could see my snorkel on the ground. So making that connection, some of them have never seen that before. And then of course some of them were like, why are you reading when you could be down there swimming? So just, you know, using what you have to teach your students and make those connections for some students who'll never see. You know, this one was, you know, what do you think happened right before this bird was sitting on the table? And so they had to, you know, make those inferences about birds flying. And, you know, of course, then I had to explain that my grandpa was a vet. And this one was footprints. Can you infer 5 things I found on the beach? What happens to footprints after the sand washes them away? And then I showed them, because some of them have never stepped on the sand, knew that your footprints leave prints and that the water will just wash them away. So just taking what I do and then giving it back to the classroom in a way that they can relate to it. So STAR, it's its own genre, is what I do in my class. You want better test scores, I think you've got to really have that creativity, have them creating their vocabulary posters, have them working with their responsibility partners, have them, you know, doing the scavenger hunts, you know, working on cutting your questions apart and having them just really dive deep into it, you know. But you got to build those relationships. If you don't have a relationship with them, they're not going to want you to teach them, and they're not going to learn anything. And every time my students made a connection, I rewarded them with a star. And there were so many times that one of them would say, oh, I just made a connection. And I said, okay, everybody stop what you're doing. Share your connection with us. And they would share like, oh, and then of course other people would say, okay, everyone's got 30 seconds, share their connection. And so we'd all stop, share a connection, we all just got through talking, we communicated, now let's get back to work. And they were really good at stopping, sharing, and getting right back to work. So I introduced STAR as its own genre, because it's not like any normal thing you would read. When I introduced and I have not done this yet, but I wasn't very happy with my STAR results this year. So before, I had always introduced STAR as its own genre, about the 5th, 6th weeks, for us to start reviewing, and I had, lots of copies of all the different release tests, and we'd go dive through and find questions that we didn't know what words meant. But in hindsight, I think I would like to introduce STAR as its own genre whenever I introduce all my other genres, and really focus on that all year, mentioning it nonchalantly, referring to it when I'm looking at different types of questions, instead of waiting so long to introduce that. Most importantly, I always explain to them that I've already taught you everything you need to know. There's nothing to be, nothing surprising. You know everything that's on there, and it's just a reflection of how well I taught. So just go in and show them what you know. I do, however, change my vocabulary wall that last review session. The month before the test, I have them go through and look at the Release STAR test, and I have them pick out vocabulary words that they don't know that are asked in the questions, and then we take those words and we put them up on our word wall. And now we make vocabulary posters with those, and we do what's the word with those, and we do create our dictionaries out of those, just to get that last bit of what are you missing, what do you need to work on, because we've done no academic vocabulary all year, but obviously there's still something that you're not understanding, so let's figure what it is, let's get it done and get it over with. And I do that the last little bit. And so that's it. That's how I teach like a pirate. I think in closing I said, fake it till you are what you want to be. I wasn't always confident in teaching, but I just am that way with kids, so I just fake it until I am. Sometimes I'm embarrassed whenever I come out dressed in a floppy hat and sunglasses, but then I look at the children's faces and see how much joy it brings to them and how excited they are about learning. So just fake it. If you're uncomfortable with it, just fake it until you can do it. And another thing is that I never teach the same thing twice. I don't know if that's a plus or a minus. It's just always something I've done. I want to be bored teaching the same thing, but I also know that every student is different, and every year you have a different group of students, and so you need to just embrace that, and you have to teach to those students, not the students you had last year or the year before that. So for that reason, I build new relationships every year, I have new learning activities every year, and I make new lesson plans every year. And so I think that's just one of the reasons why I have that passion and I stay refreshed. And I didn't pay them to lay here and read books on that picture. They actually did that. That was one morning from 7:15 to 7:45. I had that many students in there that wanted to read.
That's good.
And this is whenever we did our baseball review, it happened to be Easter. And so I put the questions inside Easter eggs, and they were for text features. And so the text feature was in the Easter egg, and then they had to find the question that it went to be able to match that, and then we'd play baseball. But I had to throw an egg spin, just something to keep them motivated.
That's right.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it, and it was worthwhile, and you learned a little bit more about how to teach like a pirate. Thank you so much for listening.
It was very nice, very enjoyable.
Okay.
And I learned a lot.